Disease, epidemics, pestilence, and the threat of degeneration. This terrible reality has haunted humanity since ancient times. In fact, we fight to stay alive every day, but not always with success. There are occasions, however, when we just give up in the teeth of chaos because we don't know how to resist danger effectively. Nature and a human. This opposition is eternal, and no matter how hard we try, it can throw a curve that people cannot always handle. During certain periods of its existence, humanity fell under the outbreaks of diseases that repeatedly raised the question of the outright depopulation of the world and, accordingly, the existence of civilization as such. These diseases did not just cause harm and damage, but ruthlessly destroyed Homo sapiens, which due to various circumstances was always in the eye of the storm, exposed to many historical and natural disasters. One of such deadly and, so to speak, epic diseases in history, on the scale of virtually the whole world, was cholera. During periods of its violent revelry that happened with unenviable regularity, a huge number of people died out. It should be noted that the population of our planet did not number many billions of individuals back then. That's what it did with the human body, although it actually keeps doing this from time to this day. A single small bacterium called Vibrio cholera. There is a hypothesis that most of the diseases in that era proliferate worldwide mainly from the Asian and Indian regions. This was due to the peculiarities of a religious nature, the rituals of the burial of the dead in local rivers. If you look at this situation from the position of today, you can be quite rightly horrified. Anyway, feel free to express yourself. Such cult rites are still held here and there, although in the old days they were perceived as something ordinary, and no one thought much about the epidemiological consequences of such religious practices to the misfortune of all humankind. If we get lost in the mists of time, one of the earliest pieces of evidence of the existence of cholera that has come down to us was that of Hippocrates, who lived in the 4th century BC. In principle, this unshakable authority in the field of medicine determined the symptoms of this disease, although at that time the systematization of diseases was not developed at all. However, the truth is, by that time, cholera had occupied its niche in a large number of serious diseases. The phenomenon described by the scientist was called the Hippocrates face and was evidence of severe diseases in the patient's abdominal cavity. Here's how it was expressed. Pinched nose, sunken eyes, and fallen temples. The ears are cold and retracted. The earlobes are turned. The skin on the forehead is tight, stretched, and dry. The facial color is green, black, or pale, or leady, wrote Hippocrates. Of course, based on present realities, such symptoms may also suit other diseases, but medicine was still significantly limited in its capabilities back then. At the same time, the main thing is that even in ancient times, physicians from different countries were able to distinguish cholera from other diseases. Although, to be honest, even in its very name, a gross semantic inaccuracy lies. It comes from the Greek words choli and rheo, which translate as to drip with the bile. That is, the physicians of that time took abundant liquid discharge of patients with cholera, up to a quarter of the total body weight, for bile. Although because of such a trifle, no one bothered to change the accustomed name then or subsequently. It got accustomed, and no one needed additional confusion in terminology. It is difficult to say exactly how cholera manifested itself over the next many centuries and what other diseases physicians, and even more so society, could take it for. But until the 19th century, they did not even really think about systematizing the official symptoms of the disease, especially as medicine in those days, in simple terms, was just moving to a truly scientific basis, without religious impurities and relying solely on facts and experiments. That, however, did not prevent tragic situations from occurring periodically. For example, the French physician François Broussais, during one of the world cholera pandemics in 1830 to 1831, practiced the treatment of the disease with the so-called exhausting diet, when the patient was not given any food or water at all. In other words, they were starved and tormented by thirst. Leeches and abundant bloodletting enhanced the effect. Overall, it is not surprising that the physician's patients, instead of the desired cure for the disease, went to the other world in mass and in anguish.
That's a pretty good example.
Nevertheless, Broussais was not the only physician who believed in this method. In those days, people were already aware that it was possible to decontaminate water through its chlorination. In this regard, responsible persons make active use of this method, but not always correctly calculated the dose of bleach. As a result, many people were severely poisoned, at the most, just by drinking water. Concisely, the road to victory over cholera was scattered with not only its immediate victims, but also the desire for experiments that were not always helpful. However, if we take the facts of those days' life in their entirety as a basis, scientists were faced with a number of factors unknown to them until that time, which literally turned medical science over. Many diseases that used to be incurable and extremely contagious migrated to the category of practically harmless ones. Effective drugs were quickly invented to cure others. But as far as cholera was concerned, the medical community had great difficulties. However, at that time, its first outbreaks in the world occurred, which very soon turned into epidemics, and then into pandemics. This infection, as we've already noted, originated in India, on the territory of modern Bengal. But until the 19th century, it almost did not spread outside of Asia. However, when it broke free, the situation in the world deteriorated sharply. It is important to realize that it is not Vibrio cholera itself that causes the disease, but the exotoxin it produces. When the virus enters the human body, it settles in the intestines and quickly switches to breeding actively, displacing water. This is a highway to dehydration and diarrhea. By the way, some of those who fell ill with cholera managed to escape not with a full-fledged disease, but only with cholera-like dysentery. Of course, it's hardly pleasant, but the main thing is that they often manage without a fatal outcome. In a word, everything is a matter of chance and providence. The incubative stage of the disease is 24 to 48 hours on average. With a mild or moderate degree, according to the statistics of the World Health Organization, it is observed in 80 to 90% of episodes. Unpleasant symptoms often disappear in just a few days. Only every fifth infected person has a severe form of cholera, which, if medical care is not provided in time, can lead to death. Behind these seemingly cold statistics, there are still human lives. Curiously, many people infected with V. cholera do not get cholera, although the virus can live in their bodies for several weeks. Furthermore, as scientists have established, in about 4 to 5% of those who have been ill, the Vibrio remains in the gallbladder forever. Patients who have had the disease develop immunity to it, with one nuance. New strains are capable of infecting an individual who has already recovered from cholera. No wonder they say that viruses are very insidious and dodgy microorganisms that can adapt to new conditions no worse than a human can. Infection most often occurs in regions with traditionally poor hygienic and sanitary conditions and high population density, in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. In these areas, outbreaks of cholera are observed all year round, and it mainly affects children and adolescents, whereas adults have already acquired immunity during previous epidemics. Therefore, from there, the disease proceeds to conquer other continents in different ways. Cholera bacilli tends to reproduce quickly in both fresh and salt water. Vibrio leaves the body with urine, fecal matter, and vomit, and enters a new habitat for itself through the mouth or unwashed hands. Actually, the mechanism of the process is clear, and in the absence of disinfection means, which is especially typical for poor countries, and constant use of wastewater as a drink, cholera felt free enough, developing through cities and countries almost at lightning speed. The famous German scientist, the founder of microbiology Robert Koch, discovered the causative agent of cholera. This fundamental event for science took place in 1883, when he made observations in Egypt and India. The scientists found that it was water that caused the spread of cholera in those areas. Koch noticed that people wash clothes in local rivers and ponds. Toilets are located right on the banks of the reservoirs, and then the population takes water to drink there. You must admit that it could not be otherwise. All conditions were created for cholera. Based on studies of both the feces of patients and the contents of the intestines of people who had already fell victims of cholera, Koch grew microbes in an attempt to thoroughly study the nature of the disease. As a result, he learned that vibrios look like curved sticks, which were called Koch's comma bacilli. It is noteworthy that at first, the illustrious scientist himself could not prove that these microorganisms were indeed the causative agents of the disease, because, despite all his efforts, he could not infect animals with them. Only later it turned out that warm-blooded animals do not suffer from cholera at all, and the disease, except for humans, was subsequently detected only in plankton and mollusks. Nevertheless, the return of Koch to Germany with this information was victorious and hailed with recognition and a reward of 100,000 marks into the bargain. His Italian colleague, anatomist Filippo Pacini, who described cholera bacteria in detail back in the mid-1850s but did not receive any support for his discovery, was not so lucky. And all because in his studies he could not physically select those commas, although their presence was more than expressive in the scientist's drawings. We'd also add that Koch's hypothesis has been questioned and even persecuted for more than 1 year. For example, in 1892, the president of the Bavarian Academy of Sciences, hygienist Max Pettenkofer, publicly drank a glass of Vibrio cholera suspension, which was sent from Koch's laboratory. The scientist conducted such an experiment because he was convinced that the clue to cholera was not at all in the microbes. The funny thing is that Pettenkofer managed not to contract this disease, but Koch's theory was fully confirmed over time. Was it luck or a twist of fate? However, now let's come down to the essentials, or rather, to those periods where cholera spread across the planet at a high rate. According to official data, there were only 7 such major attacks, and the first of them dates back to 1816 to 1824. It is difficult to say what exactly provoked the outbreak, but there is a version. The weather anomaly is to blame. The fact is that in 1815, on the territory of modern Indonesia, the Tambora volcano woke up. Many people died because of the eruption itself, but the consequences of the incident were much more significant. The fact is that the planet had an occasion to survive the so-called year without summer. Imagine, in the spring of 1816, there was a real winter in Europe. The same thing happened in America in the summer. The weather is similar on other continents. Under such conditions, superimposed on the ever-hungry, everyday life of humanity, cholera triumphantly marched across most of the planet, reaching the very outskirts of Eurasia. Largely, the British Army, whose units were located in India and nearby areas at the time, also contributed to this. At first, only a few soldiers became infected with cholera, but in a little while, the disease spread in the army, and then the military carried it to other countries: Nepal, Afghanistan, China, Japan, and African states. By 1820, the epidemic struck East Africa, and then gained a foothold in the Arabian Peninsula, Persia, Turkey, and the Caucasus. Until now, no one has turned to calculate the exact number of deaths caused by the epidemic. Researchers are unanimous only that the number goes to the hundreds of thousands of people. However, the most interesting thing is that it ended with what it started with, that is, the abnormal cold in 1823 to 1824. For some time, the planet calmed down, but the pause did not last long. People did not even have time to forget about cholera properly. As long as in 1829, alarming news came from India. The situation with the disease, its nature was virtually unknown at that time, was heating up again. And that time was like this: colonial wars, constant battles, armies moving randomly everywhere, and at the same time, intercontinental trade was rapidly developing. How can there not be at least a small epidemic here? As a result, cholera raged during the second pandemic, according to some sources until 1851 almost all over the world, except perhaps its most isolated corners. Virtually all of Asia and the Middle East took the fall. In Egypt alone, the disease claimed the lives of about 150,000 people. Europeans and Americans suffered greatly, and cholera reached even the Russian Empire. Russia was marked by such a phenomenon as the cholera riots in 1830 to 1831. The fact is that the peasantry, subjected to quarantine restrictions, considered that the authorities, having gained physician support, decided to exterminate the whole people without knowing exactly why. Besides, food prices went up sharply. Ordinary people could no longer feed themselves and died not so much from cholera as from hunger. At the same time, for a bribe, quarantine could be avoided, and instead of weeks or months of isolation, you could get freedom in 2 hours. While relatively wealthy citizens could afford it, where could ordinary villagers get money? All this resulted in massive popular uprisings, when the peasants smashed the noble houses, usually together with the nobles themselves who bought off the quarantine, killed gendarmes, officials, and certainly physicians. The rebellion was eventually suppressed, but in terms of figures, at that time more than 460,000 people fell ill with cholera in the Russian Empire, of which almost 200,000 could not handle the disease. The situation was actually not much better in Europe. In France alone, about 200,000 people died from cholera, and given the colonial policy of Paris at the time, very soon the disease successfully migrated to Africa, and from there to Australia. That is, it was a real pandemic. By the way, an interesting episode. When during the years 1831 to 1832, cholera took the lives of about 30,000 citizens in the UK, the authorities of the American New York forbade ships from the United Kingdom to enter their port. It seems to be the right and understandable decision, but somehow cholera nevertheless leaked into the city, resulting in the death of about 3,500 people. Before I forget, speaking of Great Britain, there was a rumor in the city of Birmingham in 1832 that the authorities were burying people with cholera alive in order to avoid new infections. The people, armed with shovels, ran to the cemeteries to dig up the graves, in the hope of finding those buried still alive. Of course, all this was in vain, and the attempts of the police to stop the riot ended in the deaths of several people. They were only reassured by the fact that the dead dug out of the graves showed no signs of life. The third cholera pandemic, which fell in the years 1846 to 1860, as you can see, if you believe the official data, the second had not even finished yet, is considered to be the one that claimed the largest number of lives on the planet in the 19th century. According to tradition, it originated in India, and the world community was so shocked by the extent of the disease, from which, among others, the 11th U.S. President James Polk died, that in 1851, the first International Sanitary Convention was established in France, designed to fight primarily cholera. According to eyewitnesses, the disease played havoc. The poor people died like flies. The townspeople fled from Paris. Others were locked up. There were not enough beds in the hospitals. The police did not have enough coffins, and in the houses, crammed full of different families, the bodies remained for 2 days. As you can see, the picture is simply a staggering one, and striking into the marrow. After all, whole families, which were not allowed to bury the deceased as quickly as possible by funeral traditions, disappeared this way. With devastating effects, cholera swept through the UK. Its expertise in this should be mentioned separately, because it was the state that acted as a true reformer in the fight against the dangerous disease. Thus, local economist Edwin Chadwick, even before the start of the third cholera pandemic, presented a report, Sanitary Standards of the Working Population, at a meeting of Parliament. In it, the scientists linked the spread of infections to the living conditions of the people, And then, at his initiative, they passed a law on the permanent water supply to homes and the creation of a network of sewage collectors. The British physician John Snow, who published the essay On the Mode of Communication of Cholera in 1849, went even further, pointing out the immediate causes of the phenomenon: dirty water, infection due to unwashed hands, and patients' excretions. Nothing contributes to the spread of cholera like a lack of personal cleanliness. The bed linen nearly always becomes wetted by the cholera evacuations, and as these are devoid of the usual color and odor, the hands of persons waiting on the patient become soiled without their knowing it. And unless these persons are scrupulously cleanly in their habits and wash their hands before taking food, they must accidentally swallow some of the excretions and leave some on the food they handle or prepare, which has to be eaten by the rest of the family, John Snow wrote. In 1854, in London, on one of the sections of Broad Street, more than 600 people died of cholera in just 10 days. Snow was puzzled by this fact and did a little research. As a result, he found out that the residents of this neighborhood took water from the same pump, and in it, which was common practice at that time, drains fell from the house where a child with cholera lived. Still in doubt, the physician went to the municipality, and the first thing he did was to close the pump. So what do you think? The epidemic subsided at once, and the authorities of London immediately and decisively took up radical reform of the water management in the city? True, at first some noticed an omission in Snow's theory. For some reason, not a single person in the monastery located on the same broad street fell ill with cholera. However, the truth was revealed quickly. It turned out that the church had a brewery, and the monks drank beer instead of water. And now, attention. Remember, this story happened in 1854, and Koch's commas and the connection of cholera with poor quality water were officially presented to the world only 3 decades later. Alas, at that time, science did not have such a speed of information exchange as it is today. If it would be the opposite, perhaps the subsequent scale of the cholera problem could be avoided. Besides, the so-called miasma theory was popular in the scientific circles of that era, according to which some contagious principles hovered in the atmosphere, although no one was able to explain their essence. And as the air in those distant times was as far from perfect as it is today, many infectious diseases were allegedly transmitted through it, including cholera. Some scientists even claimed that inhaling food aromas could lead to obesity. The development of the miasma theory resulted in the building of hospitals with purposefully huge windows in many cities. They were kept open all year round so that the sick could always breathe fresh air. It is not known how many people caught pneumonia or other serious diseases following such experiments, but there is no getting away from the fact. Similarly, the therapy in which cholera-infected people were given special belts to cool their bellies, which were supposed to help them overcome the disease, may seem ridiculous today. It is noteworthy that such an element was even used in army ammunition in the mid-1850s. So the third wave of the cholera pandemic ended approximately in 1860. A short respite of a few years, and again bad news from India came. The fourth cholera pandemic lasted from 1863 to 1875 and was characterized by even higher rates of spread due to the appearance of the Suez Canal. With its help, the disease entered Europe not in years or months, but in a matter of weeks. The first to suffer, and this was quite logical, were the maritime powers of Spain, France, Italy, where ships from North Africa were sent, and from there the disease spread throughout Europe. There is evidence that 633,318 people fell ill with cholera, and 238,027 died in 1870 alone. But these data are not official. Furthermore, due to the high cost of treatment and the lack of money, some patients were placed in shelters for the poor, and people died en masse there, without medical care, in terrible agony. There was another option. The sick were simply taken out to the nearby forests to die. In those days, such a concept as insurance medicine was not known. The fifth cholera pandemic, which raged in 1881 to 1896, was marked by a number of revolutionary discoveries about the nature of this disease. We have already mentioned the sensational discovery of the German scientist Robert Koch. Here is a quote from his work on the nature of cholera. "It can be assumed that only a fraction of people exposed to the risk of infection become ill, and these are usually people who previously suffered from indigestion. Apparently, bacilli can pass the gastric barrier only if there are any pathological changes in the stomach. The individual susceptibility of the organism plays an important role. In a liquid medium, Vibrio cholera is able to live and grow for weeks. Only when wet these microbes can transfer from one host to another. No one has ever had cholera twice. Apparently, it builds strong immunity," Robert Koch wrote. However, many of his other colleagues also participated in the research of the disease. For example, in 1883, the famous scientist Ilya Mechnikov and his two assistants, physicians Latamy and Jupil, took a chance and conducted an experiment on infecting themselves with cholera. This happened in order to prove that it was the Vibrio discovered by Koch that was the source of the disease. As a result, Mechnikov and Latamy remained alive and well, but Jupil caught cholera and died. Sometimes science requires sacrifice. During the fifth pandemic, Vladimir Kovkin from Odessa, a student of that very Mechnikov, was developing a cholera vaccine and succeeded. In 1892, he tested the drug on himself, and it turned out to be effective against the disease. At the same time, for example, in 1892 to 1893, more than 620,000 cholera infections were registered in Russia, and half of those infected lost their fight against it. This time, the empire failed to avoid popular uprisings. The reason was not only quarantine restrictions, followed by the impoverishment of hundreds of thousands of people, but also another circumstance. The fact is that death due to cholera sometimes manifests itself as follows. The body can spontaneously unbend its arms or legs, and it can also roll over and even sit down. Imagine a funeral cortege of a person who died of cholera, when the deceased suddenly, so to speak, comes to life abruptly and sits down in the coffin. The crowd is indignant and rushes in search of a physician who declared the death of a person. Only during the fifth cholera pandemic in the Russian Empire, more than 400 physicians were killed because of this. That's awful. Good I'm not a Russian physician. As far as civilized Europe is concerned, terrible things also happened there from time to time. The illustrative example was of German Hamburg, where in the summer of 1892 more than 8,000 people died of cholera. All because the local authorities flatly refused to build a modern water supply system. And when the disease was already raging in earnest, it did not introduce quarantine and hid data on mortality from cholera. This can be explained quite easily. Hamburg was a port city, and such a truth would send its economic life over the edge. As a result, the German government intervened, which actually forcibly isolated the city. The authorities sent a team of specialists there led by Robert Koch. Upon arrival, he quickly figured out the situation. He ordered to introduce quarantine, stop the work of enterprises and trade, place patients in isolation rooms, and disinfect all over the place. Koch also decided to give local residents purified water and teach them personal hygiene, such as washing their hands after using the toilet. It worked. Officials who sabotaged the process of modernizing water supply and sewerage were expelled from their posts, and a large-scale reconstruction of the water system started in Hamburg. It remains for us to add that this was the last great outbreak of cholera in Germany, as well as in Western Europe, which took a lesson from what happened in time and began to intensively deal with the issue of thorough water filtration. By the way, the fifth cholera pandemic was also characterized by the fact that the virus got in all of South America, where it had practically not manifested itself until that time. Not that cholera terrified the continent back then, but it claimed tens of thousands of lives. By the way, according to some reports, cholera killed at least 10 million people in the 19th century, which made it one of the deadliest diseases of that time. The sixth cholera pandemic was the longest, covering the period from 1899 to 1923. The virus, having traditionally come from India, with the exception of Antarctica, has invaded all continents. At the same time, during the next pandemic, research on the nature of the disease was underway. Moreover, they still believe that the causative agent of cholera is only its classic Vibrio. However, in 1905, the German scientist Felix Gottschalk made an important discovery. It happened at a quarantine station called El Tor, which was located on the Sinai Peninsula, Egypt. At the very nonce, pilgrims were returning from Mecca, the holy place for all Muslims. Many of them died in mid-course from acute attacks of indigestion and diarrhea. After doing the necessary research, Gottschalk discovered another cholera vibrio in the intestines of the unfortunate, which they called El Tor. At the same time, in scientists' opinion, it was harmless, although later, in the 1930s, the virus caused many problems in some regions of the planet, being distinguished by an increased mortality rate. However, for some reason, the scientific community ignored this fact for quite a long time. Largely, the First World War, which began in 1914, contributed to the spread of cholera. The logic is clear enough. Military operations, the regular movement of armies, all these factors left their mark on the sequence of events. Speaking of the civilian population, massive malnutrition has played its role once again. And when, after the end of the war, the military began to return home, cholera felt completely on its familiar ground. It was characterized by a high mortality rate, especially among the elderly and, importantly, young people. It should be noted that medical science was moving further and further in the study of cholera at that time, due to which the disease communication rate slowed down significantly, although, of course, it did not completely disappear. Besides, the world community finally began to take preventive measures that helped to contain the cholera advance. So, at the end of the sixth wave, the disease acquired the status of local outbreaks with a relatively small number of victims. Even more shocking was the return of cholera in the middle of the 20th century, or rather in 1961 to 1975. Can you guess the name of the seventh pandemic? El Tor, by the name of the same Vibrio, which was not recognized as dangerous for so long, although it turned out to be really deadly and persistent, and by 1970 it was already in charge in 39 states. This time, cholera originated in Indonesia and was distinguished by the appearance of hybrid forms that provoked the emergence of new virus strains. Despite the fact that the pandemic officially ended almost half a century ago, its consequences are still observed in many countries, especially poor and developing ones, and the seventh wave of cholera was noted in more than 180 countries. At that time, physicians were able to detect this disease almost accurately, but there was one more circumstance. Cholera no longer had its former habitat and frequency of manifestations, and therefore its main symptoms could be mistaken for something else. And so it happened. For example, as in Uzbekistan, a country in Central Asia, in 1965, local physicians thought that it was arsenic poisoning, which was used as a pesticide in those days. And when the mistake was revealed, they could not easily stop cholera in this region. As I said, in Western Europe, the fifth cholera pandemic was the last to have a large scale. But in 1973, the virus somehow still entered Italian Naples. The local environment favored the spread of cholera, since this city was then considered one of the dirtiest in the whole state, and its inhabitants hardly observed personal hygiene rules. At first, Naples authorities adamantly refused to believe that the insidious disease had made its way into their territory, and therefore clumsily tried to attribute everything to an outbreak of gastritis that had come from nowhere. Although the situation escalated every day, the inhabitants of the city took to the streets with protests, demanding protection from cholera. It all ended with the fact that the physicians of the 6th U.S. Fleet came to the rescue of the Neapolitans. They vaccinated the population, and the disease was brought under control. Italian football suffered from the situation most, where the season could well have ended ahead of schedule. This did not happen in the end. The most interesting and wildest episode took place within the framework of the National Cup. During the Genoa-Napoli match, the host team asked the rivals not to come to their region, rightly fearing that they would bring cholera vibrio with them. Then the football officials, after consulting, offered to move the match to Naples. Naturally, the frightened Genoa players refused, and as a result, the team got a forfeited defeat. Instead, the players remained healthy. So, 1975 was marked by the end of the 7th and currently the last cholera pandemic on the planet. However, the disease itself, of course, has not disappeared completely and still manifests itself in many countries. From the beginning of the 21st century to the present day, at least 50 states report to the World Health Organization, WHO, each year on the new outbreaks of disease of various categories of complexity. Up to 3 million cases of infection and tens of thousands of deaths are recorded annually. In this millennium, the African continent especially suffers from cholera. Thus, in Zimbabwe, from August 2008 to May 2009, episodes of the disease were recorded in 55 out of 62 regions of the country. At the same time, the local authorities reported that a little less than 100,000 people fell ill. But the WHO and the UN did not particularly believe in these figures, considering them frankly understated. In 2010, WHO estimated that about 5 million people were infected with cholera on the planet, and about 130,000 cases became fatal. However, these data may not be entirely correct, so as some countries, fearing a decrease in tourist flow, deliberately hide the true state of affairs with the spread of cholera. In 2015, WHO identified 7 countries where the cholera epidemic was most visible: Cameroon, Malawi, Tanzania, South Sudan, Nepal, Iraq, and Bangladesh. There, the loss of local population due to illness, and mainly among children who do not have immunity, amounted to 140,000 people a year. The health professionals provided these countries with 1 million doses of oral cholera vaccine, which helped to stabilize the situation. The most powerful humanitarian crisis of 2017 in Yemen, where 85 to 90% of the population does not know what clean drinking water is, led to a severe cholera epidemic. As of August 14, 2017, the number of cases in the country has reached 500,000 people. More than 2,000 have died, only according to official statistics, which cannot always be trusted. The situation was not the best in other African states: Nigeria, Somalia, Zambia, Kenya, Mozambique, and Niger. Now, the international community has identified the countries with the dirtiest water in the world: Chad, Ethiopia, and Afghanistan. Cambodia, Laos, Haiti, India, and the Dominican Republic are slightly ahead of them in this indicator. Accordingly, these are critical regions where an outbreak of cholera can occur at any time. That is, you need to pay close attention to this problem, because if there is no cholera in the civilized world, this does not necessarily mean that there is nowhere else. By the way, a few words about vaccination. Don't forget that the causative agent of cholera was found back in the late 19th century, but there are still no effective drugs against the disease. As difficult as it may be for some to believe, medicine still has not found effective tools in this war. Yes, there are vaccines that are used, but they do not differ in durability and are effective for no more than 6 months. After that time, the degree of protection noticeably decreases, and in the meantime, the infection inevitably mutates, and it can no longer be overcome by the existent means. So it looks like running a lap, in the rhythm of which a significant part of the world's population lives. According to the International Center for Diarrheal Disease Research representatives, as of late 2021, 16 outbreaks of cholera were recorded in the world. Of course, scientists do not dream of giving up. For example, the Global Task Force on Cholera Control launched a program to study this disease, the goal of which is the complete eradication of cholera by 2030. Although the problem lies in the fact that funding is allocated in critically small amounts to clarifying the nature of old diseases, not to mention the fact that global problems with water supply in dozens of countries have not gone away. Therefore, it is hardly possible to count on the fact that the issue of cholera will be finally resolved by 2030. Let's summarize. For 2 centuries of its march on the planet, cholera has killed, according to the most conservative estimates, about 60 million people. The figure is actually huge. No need to measure the problem by the current billions of the world's population. But the worst thing is that modern science and medicine are not able to declare, yes, we have found an effective antidote that will rid the world of cholera once and for all. And, apparently, at least our generation cannot take the risk and wait for such a gift. Of course, one must hope that scientists, with the support of states, international and non-governmental organizations, as well as private investors, will eventually deal with the problem that worries a significant part of the planet and hundreds of millions of people. Additionally, this is also on behalf of the civilized world. After all, no one can guarantee that tomorrow cholera will not begin to spread in the United States, Great Britain, and Europe, where this disease has been practically forgotten. Are they ready to face death again? Health to all of us. Sincerely yours, Dr. PopMed.